Hey guys, June here, and in this video we're going to take a look at Yakamaru. We're going to go through every mechanic in this fight and talk about every strategy you'll need to employ to get successful kills as a team from every perspective. Before we begin, we need to appoint several roles to different members of our team. First, we need a base tank and a sand north tank, and each of these I have a more in-depth guide for on my channel. You can access each of these by clicking on the annotations on screen. We need 2 stun DPS, and I also have an additional guide for that you can access by clicking on the annotation. We need a CPR as well as a poison tank, in addition to the poison tank, a double poison for the sand pool, which I'll talk about when we get around to the sand pool portion of the guide. We need a main stunner, and we need someone to take 10 planks to cover the shark pool on the Mirage phase. A single person can often do more than one of these roles, with a few exceptions. The base tank can be neither the sand north tank nor a stun DPS, shouldn't take shark planks, should not be the CPR or the poison tank. The CPR should also not be the poison tank or the double poison tank, or vice versa. Almost everyone in the fight is going to gear up the same way, with the exception of the base tank, who I covered the gearing for in the more specific base tanking video. Let me start by saying that ranged is the ideal style for most of the roles. The extra bind duration on the stuns is wonderful for dealing with the jellyfish, the fact that you can't use Asphyxiate on the north pool cuts into the magic DPS a little bit, and the fact that you need to do prayer switches with melee is slightly inconvenient. With that said though, you can do this successfully with any attack style. Gear up with whatever your highest tier weapon is for that style, with the exception of melee, where you definitely don't want to use dual wield because you lose out on destroy on the north pool for reasons that I'll talk about later. You want to gear up with tier 90 power armor, with the exception of boots, where you can use a more reasonably inexpensive pair like Nex boots. Dominion tower gloves are a huge asset over even tier 90 power gloves because the defensive reduction on them isn't restored by Yakamaru over time, so this stacks up, and since there's a myriad of players on the team, this effect can become very dramatic very quickly. The rest of your worn equipment should be relatively self-explanatory, with everything mostly just being your best in slot items, with a focus on the DPS aura and scrimshaw. Your inventory should be relatively standard for high-level bossing as well. You'll want your enhanced Excalibur, a shield switch, a ring switch. Dreadnips are basically mandatory for raids, and your standard potion setup with an overload, an adrenaline flask, some prayers, and then a mix of Ceradomin brews and rocktails for food. Finally, as usual, beginners are welcome to use a yak and just fill it with food, but as you become more acclimated to Yakamaru's attacks and start getting good at conserving supplies, you'll probably want to swap to a Steel Titan. The last part of gearing up is going to be making some relatively unusual decisions about our ability rotation. The first important thing to remember is that all damage over time abilities are overridden if another player uses that same ability on the boss while it's still active. This means anytime we use a bleed effect, there is some probability that somebody else on our team is going to use that same bleed effect before our bleed effect has completed its full damage output. This dramatically suppresses the amount of damage that we're able to do with damage over time abilities, and due to the sheer size of the team at Yakamaru, we generally want to opt out of using these abilities whenever possible. This means removing Combust, Fragmentation Shot, and Dismember from our ability rotations. Corruption Shot and Corruption Blast are also damage over time effects, but due to the sheer strength of these two abilities, as well as the fact that the damage is more heavily weighted to the initial hits rather than the hits on the end, they are still worthwhile using as part of your rotation, despite the fact that there is a probability that they'll be cancelled early. Luckily for us, we can make up this apparent gap in our ability rotations by utilizing the very short cooldown abilities that gain boosted damage against stunned enemies. Dreadnips are a vital part of any successful strategy at Yakamaru, and the fact that they apply binds to Yakamaru means that just about every time you'll be using Rack, Piercing Shot, Punish, or Slice, you'll be receiving the boosted damage from that ability. You can optimize this rotation even further by keeping an eye on Yakamaru's debuff bar and using these abilities whenever possible when you see that bind icon active, and trying to cycle the other abilities when it's not active. However, don't fret if you're not willing to expend that kind of energy watching Yakamaru's debuffs. You should expect this effect to be active just about every time you use those abilities. Keeping all that in mind, here are some examples of how you should set your bars up with basics for Yakamaru. Aside from this, nothing special really changes about your threshold or your ultimate ability usage, aside from some specific examples using stuns that I'll talk about later on. Now let's look at some of the boss mechanics themselves. Yakamaru uses 2 attack styles depending on players' proximity to the boss. Players standing inside melee distance or very near melee distance within roughly scythe range will be hit with magic damage, roughly inside this blue circle here, and players standing outside that distance will be hit with ranged damage. Yakamaru's attacks will never actually miss the player, however they do still have an accuracy roll, and any attack that would have missed deals half as much damage as an attack that would have hit. Each of these basic attacks also applies a damage stack to anyone standing within a 7x7 radius of Yakamaru's primary target, which is likely to be the base tank. The application of the first Enrage stack is accompanied by an on-screen message that says Yakamaru's waters begin to drench you. If you see this, take this as a warning that you're standing too close to the base tank and move away if possible. Players will also occasionally receive this message when Yakamaru is in the process of moving between pools, but this can be ignored and the damage stack will wear off periodically. In general, the Enrage mechanic is only something that the base tank and the Sand North tank need to worry about, and more information about that can be seen in the base tanking video. Despite what you may have been told, it is never necessary for DPS to use Freedom, and doing so in place of an ability that could have dealt damage is wasteful. The first of Yakamaru's special attacks will occur on all phases. Yakamaru will fling out a jellyfish which has 50,000 HP as well as a really powerful AoE melee attack. When the jellyfish appears, it'll also appear alongside 5 black spots in the ground, which shortly after erupt with a geyser. If a player stands on the geyser, they'll receive roughly 2,000 magic damage when it goes off, but they'll also deal 10,000 damage to the jellyfish. The best thing to do when this occurs is to target the jellyfish, and if using ranged, fire a binding shot at it. By targeting the jellyfish, you temporarily negate Yakamaru's auto attacks, and you want to step onto one of the uncovered geysers and switch to your shield and use resonance. Since Yakamaru's attacks don't proc the res now that we've targeted the jellyfish, we make sure that we heal roughly 2,000 damage from the geyser itself, and since all of our teammates should be participating in this process, we kill the jelly in one shot by standing on all 5 geysers. If you can learn to do this effectively, you should find that you actually don't use much food at all until the Mirage phase. The second special Yakamaru also uses on any phase. This attack is generally called the Blue, and a player will be chosen at random, and they will temporarily adopt the player model of a person using Metamorphosis with water spells. This effect needs to be passed around from player to player, and a player needs to be standing directly inside melee distance to pass this effect to them. Be especially cautious because standing on top of a player will also not pass this effect to them. If the effect isn't passed, it deals typeless damage to the person holding it, starting at 1500, then 2500, 3500, and finally 4500 typeless damage. The damage is spaced out disparately enough that you can eat your way through this attack if you have to, however it's generally not a problem because the DPS tends to be grouped together, and the effect will generally pass between players without actual intervention on the player's part. If for some reason you find yourself relatively spaced out from your partners, the easiest way to pass this to someone is simply to right-click and follow them. The last important thing to remember about this special attack is that you can't pass this back to a player who has just passed it to you. The fight begins when usually the base tank spawns Yakamaru in the central pool. Yakamaru remains in this pool until the team as a whole has dealt a total of 200,000 damage to him. The only special attacks Yakamaru uses at this point are the Blue and the Jellyfish specials, so nothing special needs to be worried about at this point. When Yakamaru reaches 800,000 HP, he will move into one of the radial pools selected at random. Each of these pools gains an additional special attack or some special effect. As the fight progresses, Yakamaru will bounce back and forth between some of these radial pools and the central pool until all of the radial pools have been visited. Although the first of the radial pools is chosen at random, after that Yakamaru always proceeds in a clockwise path. For the sake of the order of this guide, I'm going to assume that Tendrils was the first pool. Just remember that your order may differ, though it always follows the clockwise rule. General practice when the fight starts is to have the DPS group roughly on the west side of the Yakamaru central pool and the base tank on the east side. Use this time to primarily focus on building adrenaline for the side pools, and after 4 attacks Yakamaru will throw his first jellyfish. Your team should deal with that as we discussed earlier, and as soon as possible resume DPSing Yakamaru. Shortly after this, Yakamaru should hit the 800,000 HP threshold and jump to one of his radial pools. Yakamaru's southernmost pool is generally referred to as the Tendril pool. Yakamaru's new special attack on this phase comes in 2 parts. First is the primary target, which generally should be the base tank, receives a spinning Tendril attack. This deals rapid damage in increments of 2,000 to anyone standing in the proximity of the attack, and strategies for dealing with it are discussed in my base tanking video. At the same time that this happens, half of the team, specifically the individuals who have dealt the most cumulative damage to Yakamaru so far on this pool specifically, are selected and choked with Tendrils. The Tendrils both prevent movement, cancel defensive abilities, and deal small typeless damage that grows over time. The Tendrils are automatically removed once a certain amount of damage has been dealt to the boss. The order that Yakamaru uses his special attacks on this phase is to throw a jellyfish, 4 auto attacks, the Blue attack, 4 auto attacks, the Tendril, and then 4 auto attacks. When Yakamaru first spawns in this pool, his position in the rotation is chosen at random, so it's very important, specifically on this phase, to let the base tag to prevent the occasional chance that the spinner will spawn in the DPS pile and essentially annihilate everyone. All we need to do at this point is to continue to DPS Yakamaru and deal with the special attacks as they come. When Yakamaru reaches 100,000 HP in this pool, everyone receives an on-screen notification that Yakamaru releases the dangerous poison. When this occurs, a single game tile nearby is selected and 4 green arrows point to that location. Our poison tank has a short time to get onto that spot to absorb the poison, then they need to run in melee distance of Yakamaru, and of course prayer switch to magic to prevent that extra incoming damage. When the pool dies, that player will be eaten and shortly after will wash up on the shore alongside 5 planks. The CPR role needs to meet that player at the shoreline and resuscitate them, or after a short time they will instantly be killed. For the record, I was not the CPR in this particular video clip. At the same time that this occurs, Yakamaru returns to the center pool and turns green temporarily. In this state, he both deals and sustains increased damage, and he also spawns a group of jellyfish. Once 200,000 HP is depleted, Yakamaru moves to the next pool, and common practice is to deal as much DPS as possible to Yakamaru while he's in the sickened state. If for any reason the poison wasn't retrieved and fed to Yakamaru, or the pool was killed before the player holding the poison was in melee distance, the entire phase needs to be repeated, and this needs to be avoided at all costs. Additionally, the planks that have spawned alongside our poisoned player are going to be used to cover some specific pools on the Mirage phase. It's important for each of our 2 stun DPS players to take 5 of them, and the person responsible for 10 planks for Shark needs to take 10 of them. Once Yakamaru moves to the Shark pool, his unique special attack is a Sharknado sort of thing. When the attack triggers, you'll notice a sort of cyclone of water with some visible sharks pooling around Yakamaru. Shortly after that, they're flung out, and a few seconds after they hit the ground, they explode and deal typeless damage to anybody who's within the blast radius. The sharks themselves also act like barriers and can occasionally cause players to run around them chaotically in an attempt to attack Yakamaru. All sorts of different things can be done to avoid the special attack. Once the sharks have landed on the ground, they can be kicked. When the cyclone itself is circling around Yakamaru, you can fish sharks out of them, reducing the overall number of sharks that are thrown. You can simply move away from them once they actually hit the ground. But the ideal method is actually standing in a few locations which specifically prevent sharks from spawning on top of players, like the one you see on screen right now. Everyone just stand on top of each other on top of one of these locations, and this one in particular seems to be the most common. Everyone can stand here aside from anyone using melee and the base tank, and the only 2 things that you need to consider are that when the blue attack comes out, whoever has it actively needs to step off from the pile temporarily to pass it to another player, and when the sharks are actually thrown, players need to spam click underneath them to prevent them from actually running out of the group because the sharks act as barriers. The cycle of special attacks on this phase is the jellyfish, 4 attacks, the blue, 4 attacks, and then the shark, and 4 attacks. Although again, Yakamaru spawns in this pool at a random point in this attack rotation. With all that in mind, we just need to keep DPSing this pool down until we reach 100,000 HP, at which point we'll have to repeat the poison cycle like we did on the Tendril pool. When the poison does spawn, we want to stop DPSing Yakamaru quite so hard to make sure that we don't kill it before the poison is actually taken. We'll give our poison tank a chance to grab it and head MD, and the CPR should head over to that location on the beach to prepare to resuscitate them. At this point we can finally finish off the pool, and Yakamaru will return to the center again, adopt the sickened state, and also spawn another group of jellyfish. When Yakamaru returns to the center after the shark pool, teams generally choose not to phase Yakamaru at this point because the special attack on the sand phase can actually ruin a kill if it occurs at a point when the team is spread out across the arena. For this one instance, we want to make sure that we kill all of the jellyfish before we phase Yakamaru into the next pool. The next pool Yakamaru goes into is the sand pool, and his new special attack on this phase is to drop the vast majority of the team into quicksand. 1 or 2 players are left out of the quicksand depending on the size of the team, and they have to pull their friends out just by clicking on them. Being dropped into the quicksand cancels your defensive abilities, and if nobody frees you before you sink fully in, you'll be instantly killed. The sand also prevents affected players from moving, which can cause problems if it occurs at the same time that the poison is released and the poison tank happens to be one of the people who's trapped. You can anticipate when this attack is going to happen because Yakamaru's attack rotation on this phase is 4 attacks, the blue, 4 attacks, the jellyfish, 4 attacks, and then the quicksand. So if the 100,000 HP threshold is imminent, and you also have a quicksand attack incoming, one of the more common practices is to simply stop attacking Yakamaru and wait for the sand to occur. Apart from all that, we just DPS this pool like normal, and at 100,000 HP when the poison comes out, this is actually where our double poison roll also comes in. Keep in mind this strategy is only useful if we still have the stun or northernmost pool left to go. The reason this is done is that the pool after this, the northernmost or commonly called the stun pool, has a few mechanics that make dealing DPS extremely easy, and it's often killed before the poison tank is able to retrieve the poison and move MD. So on any kill that the stun is not the first of the radial pools to be gone into, both the poison and the double poison rolls should pick up poison on the sand pool. One of the players will move MD to that pool and feed it, just like we did with the other pools thus far, and be resuscitated by CPR when Yakamaru returns to the middle. The other person simply has to tank this extra damage while the team deals with the stun pool and the central pool phase between pools. When Yakamaru phases to the middle, we want to make sure that the CPR is at the beach waiting to resuscitate the poison tank, and the DPS needs to focus on dealing as much damage as possible to Yakamaru while he's in his sickened state. Once we've phased Yakamaru into the next pool, we can clean up the jellyfish like normal. For the last of Yakamaru's radial pools, we have the northernmost pool, which is commonly called the stun pool. Yakamaru's unique attribute on this phase is much more of a passive effect than a special attack. The first is that Yakamaru develops some combat-style based defense affinities on this phase. Both the color of his helmet and his name actually change to reflect what current affinities he has. The combat style displayed in his name is actually the attack style that he's weakest to, which is somewhat counterintuitive. So for example, Yakamaru Melee is weakest to melee damage and most resistant to magic damage. He also has an invisible damage modifier that starts off at a very low value, causing people to hit much higher than they normally would expect to, and over time this generally increases until eventually Yakamaru will be essentially immune to all damage. The way we reset this defensive effect is by using a stun ability on Yakamaru. However, depending on how strong his defense is at that time, the stun effect will also recoil damage to all players. If a stun ability is used when Yakamaru's defense is extremely low, it hits 5,000 damage on all players, and if used when Yakamaru's defense is fully maxed out, it hits 1,000 damage. This is where the job of our main stun roll that we appointed at the beginning of the video comes in. It is absolutely vital that no player but the main stunner uses any stun abilities on this pool, and so, all of the abilities that you see on screen now should be removed from your bar if possible. The fact that you lose out on the destroy and asphyxiate abilities is what makes using magic and dual-wield melee slightly less than ideal for Yakamaru. It's also worth noting that when a player does stun Yakamaru, it changes his affinity defenses and corresponding name and helm color. Aside from this, the only specials Yakamaru uses on this phase are the jellyfish and the blue attack, so you can generally do a pretty much ideal DPS rotation. If you were able to double poison on the sand pool, have that double poison tank just stand MD on this pool because DPS can go extremely quickly on this phase. The job of the main stunner at this point is to basically watch the amount of hits that are being done to Yakamaru and stun at the proper times to reset that defensive effect and keep the DPS going. Depending on the skill level of the team, that timing generally tends to be about 800,000 HP, 500,000 HP, and 200,000 HP. Since the stun effect resets that defensive effect and makes all damage sustained to Yakamaru significantly increased, you want to save your strong damage dealing thresholds like Snapshot and Rapid Fire for immediately after that occurs. Onslaught is also a great ability to use to really power out DPS immediately after the stun, and if you're really having trouble conserving food or you're taking a lot of damage, you can use the Sacrifice ability to heal quite a bit of HP in one hit. If for any reason you were not able to get the double poison, for example if this was the first pool that Yakamaru went to, or if the player missed it, it is extremely important that all players stop attacking Yakamaru while the poison is obtained, because it is very easy to deal too much damage and kill Yakamaru before the poison is retrieved and the person is run MD. All things considered, this is likely to be both the easiest and the most entertaining and sweaty pool at the same time. The damage boosting mechanic makes it fast and really smooth, but it's also really easy to ruin a kill here if a player absent-mindedly uses an ability like Asphyxiate. Once Yakamaru has visited all of his radial pools and faces back to the middle, we need to clear the jellyfish without phasing Yakamaru and prepare for the Mirage phase. The CPR will need to resuscitate the poison tank who fed the poison to the last pool. The last set of planks will also appear at this time, so we need to make sure that both of our stun DPS as well as our Shark 10 have taken the planks that they are required to, as I discussed in the rolls at the beginning of the video. This last segment of the fight is by far the most difficult and requires the most coordination, and for the purposes of this video we're going to look at it from a DPS perspective. The perspectives of the base tank, the north tank, and the 2 stun DPS are covered in separate videos that I linked to at the beginning of this video. Once all of the jellyfish have been cleared and all of the planks have been taken by their respective roles, people should take their positions where they're going to be for the Mirage phase. For the DPS, this means standing roughly equidistant from the Tendril pool, the Shark pool, and the central pool. If possible, you want to use Natural Instinct around roughly 150,000 HP and build back to 100% for either Sunshine or Death Swiftness. When Yakamaru hits 50,000 HP, he phases into all pools simultaneously. The DPS should immediately do as much damage as possible to the Shark pool, which only has a total HP of 150,000. From this point forward, if Yakamaru spawns jellyfish, simply stun them, don't worry about standing on these spots and trying to kill them like we discussed earlier. When the pool is killed, the person who was responsible for taking the 10 planks to cover the shark pool needs to run MD and click on the pool to cover it with the planks. If for any reason this isn't done, Yakamaru will shortly respawn with an additional 150,000 HP. Once the shark pool is dead and filled, the DPS should turn their attention to the Tendril pool. Unlike the shark pool, in order to close this pool after we've defeated Yakamaru, all players need to run melee distance and spam click on the pool to fill it with sand. 10 increments of sand are required to fill the pool, and because there's a short cooldown between applications, one player can only put in at most 4 buckets of sand. Just like with the shark pool, if for any reason enough sand is not put inside, Yakamaru will respawn in the pool with an additional 150,000 HP that you'll need to deal with. At this point, the DPS should all surge over to the sand pool area. By now, the stun DPS should also have closed the stun pool, which you can see is not the case in this particular video clip, but for general purposes you will expect for this to be the only pool remaining at this point. The sand pool is closed in the same fashion as the Tendril pool, so it's important for all players to run MD, and there is some small risk that Yakamaru will use the quicksand attack right as it coincidentally is dying, and this will cause players to not be able to fill it in time. This should be a relatively rare occurrence, but if it does happen, focus on freeing your teammates and don't worry about trying to apply sand at that time. Once you kill and cover the sand pool, Yakamaru phases back to the central pool for his remaining 50,000 HP. At this point the hard part's over, but there is likely to be a pretty large army of jellyfish running around, so do your best to avoid the AoE melee attacks if possible. The last 50,000 HP should be depleted in just a few seconds, and when Yakamaru dies, all of the jellyfish will die as well. That's all there is to Yakamaru, guys. Thank you as always for watching, and I wish you all very good luck with your kills. This is a really awesome boss that has tons and tons of room for improvement and adapting very meticulous meta strategies with, so I hope you take what you learned in this video and try some stuff out, experiment a little bit, and see if you and your friends can find some strategies that work really great for you guys. So thanks again.